If you have a Bible, you open it up to the very first book. So if you picked up your very first Bible this week or even this morning, I know you can find this one. This is the very first book in your Bible, the book of Genesis. And we're going to be working through the second part of the story here. We're not going to hit every chapter in the Bible, of course. We talked about creation last week, and we're going to look now at, I guess, the most well-known, popular part of God's story, period. It is the moment in history in which there was a flood and an ark and a guy named Noah. And some of you had the same experience I did. When you were a child, you had no choice. They didn't ask you when you were 2 years old, do you feel like getting up and going to church? Like, you were just there. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful pretty much for the first 18 years of my life. My parents never asked my opinion about anything. But I was brought into a church environment. And one of the first stories I'm sure that I learned as a kid was this moment about Noah, an ark, and a flood. Because most kids don't want to hear the Sermon on the Mount. They don't really want to read through the letters of the New Testament. But you talk about a big old box with a bunch of animals, and that's exciting. So it's probably in there, the flood, the water, Noah, maybe the lion's den, and then perhaps after that, Jonah and the big fish. So those are the big three. And we're going to look at that first one today. And I think even though this is one of the most well-known, it's one of the hardest to handle. And I'm becoming increasingly evident, it's more aware to me rather, that this might be one of the most misunderstood of all of the moments in history. So we're going to jump into it today. It's about 1,000 years after Adam was created. If we were just trace back genealogies, this person lived this long and then had this child. And so about 1,000 years have passed. A guy named Noah is born. And then about 450, 480 years after that, we have Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, in which God said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. And then if you follow things through, you'll realize about 120 years later, when Noah is 600 years old, the flood takes place. Now, there are a lot of things along the way. Like, 600, are you, like, I know lots of questions along the way, and we can't stop and deal with each one, and most of them are going to be, well, this is what the historical records say, and we don't really have a ton of answers as to why. But we have this moment here, we know that happened about 600 years or so into Noah's life. And at this point, God has announced in a way that he is going to do something significant in 120 years. And what that turned out to be was what we know and what we call the flood. God washed everything clean. So some questions pop up. As one, why water? Why this way? Why not just Thanos it and, kind of be done with it, snap the fingers and just wipe it out and begin again? Why not do something else? I mean, if you're that mad, just burn the whole place down and begin again. If you could say, let there be light, and there's light, surely you could say, let there be everything minus, why this? And I think the waters are important because what God is communicating, and among other things, is this is a cleansing. This is a washing. This is not I can't look at you anymore, snap my fingers and get you out of here. This is a washing. And if you go back to the creation that we talked about last week, a lot of the questions there as well, but you have this moment in which God is separating land and waters. But prior to that, we have this picture of just a bunch of waters, an abyss of water. Like, that is what God was working with. We don't have a moment necessarily where God says, let there be H2O, and then she just kind of flowed out. It was God looked over at the abyss, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and then God began to separate, create land, and on and on and on. So you got this return to the beginning that God is doing here. And I think we're supposed to see this. And that we have this washing of creation with God having in mind that he's going to begin again. But why water? Another question, why wait this long? I mean, it's been over 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years or so since Adam is there. And my wife, even this week, she always brings this up. She forgets she does. But she's like, why did we wait this long? Why not the moment they ate the apple, just go, boom, Jesus. Now let's just save the thing and move on. Why wait this long? And there are a lot of answers like that just we don't have. But what we do know is that there was a point in time where God said enough was enough. And I think if we're going to figure this out, I think one of the things we need to make sure that we're all on the same page with is the world was not this really good world filled with a few 100,000 really good people who were doing their very best, but that stinking punishment from the eating the fruit in the garden messed everything up, and now we're waiting, and if it weren't, that is not what was going on. Creation was in chaos, and creation had turned on itself. I mean, Cain killing Abel was awful, but that was just multiplied for the next 1,000 years. So you had civilizations being built on murder and rape and blood, and it was an awful, awful place. So God looks down at it and says, I'm going to wash it clean. But we do have a little, maybe an example, a little hint as to why maybe it happened then. But to get to this point, we're about to open up something that is really, I believe, the weirdest and strangest thing in the entire story of God. And it's found in the verses around the verse 3 that we just read. And I call this a Buc-ee's moment. Because on any trip you're taking, on any journey you go on any road trip, there is a way to travel and then there is a way not to travel. And the way to travel is to remind yourself, I paid a high price for where we're going. So we are going to efficiently get there in the most wise way, which means we're going to pull off at the quickest, fastest places on our right. We're going to get back in the car and we're going to go. We have to fuel up. We have to go to the bathroom. We'll have to get snacks. We are going on. Then there is the wrong way to travel, where you say, oh, there's a Buc-ee's. And then you do something about it. And in my way of thinking, like that, you're just asking to add an hour to your trip. Why would you get in the car for a 10-hour trip and choose to spend an extra hour at Buc-ee's? That makes no efficiency sense at all to me. Now, obviously, I'm passionate about one way there. I kind of showed my hand. My wife, on the other hand, rushing makes her anxious. And if she feels like we're in a hurry and she can't really understand why we're in a hurry, anxiety just builds with her. Which to me, the louder and the faster, I just kind of chill. I'm good with that. Not so much with her. So a couple of weeks ago when we took our annual vacation trip together, I thought, you know what? I don't want to stress her out. Like, she deserves better than that. I even remembered a couple of verses, like, basically treat her like Jesus treated the church. Like, you know what? We're doing this. I didn't tell them. We had just crossed over. It was still pretty early. We crossed over into Alabama, driving down I-65. I saw the sign. I see the impending doom. I see Buc-ee's 13 mile. I thought, what says, I love you, we're not in a hurry, this is a restful week for you, than me just offering up 55 minutes of my day to do nothing when it could have taken 6 over here at the BP. Like, why? I thought, I'll do it. And I pulled over, and my wife kind of woke up a little and said, what are we doing? I said, we're going to take a stop. At Buc-ee's? I said, we are. And the whole crowd in my car just is really silent. Kids are looking at each other like, what's wrong? Like, what's happening? Like, what are we doing? Like, we're going to stop. We're just going to chill. So on any trip, and as we take our trip together through the story of God, there are going to be several Buc-ee's moments where we've got to be careful. We can't stay forever, but to ignore it is just to rush through it, and you're going to wonder, why did we rush through that thing? And okay, so we are. Verse 1, Genesis 6. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, the verse that we just read a moment ago, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. What in the Twilight Zone is going on? Because if you're a little new to this, you're going, well, obviously it's not literal, because what I'm literally reading is that there are some spiritual beings who came down and invaded our space and got human girls pregnant, and then they have offspring called the Nephilim. So what does that really mean? Well, what it really means is there were spiritual beings who came and invaded our space and were attracted to human ladies, and they had children that are called the Nephilim. This is weird. This is really, really strange. And I think for most of my life, I just moved on because I can't wrap my head around it. And I can promise you that Mrs. Hazel in first grade Sunday school, when she's telling me the story of the flood, did not pause for reflection on verse 1, 2, and 4. One, kids can't process that. Two, I'm sure she couldn't process that, and I'm still working through it as well. But there is evidence here that somehow what should have remained in the heavens, spiritual beings, rebelled against God just as men and women rebelled. And in this moment, the spiritual beings rebelled against God to the point where they came down to our space, and the Nephilim were these offspring. These, not half God, but these spiritual beings that were also created beings. Because God did create the heavens and the earth. God did create the sun, moon, and stars. God did create everything out there that's governing the stars. And here they're able to connect. So I don't want to let this Buc-ee's moment last. We have to move on. But for those of you who are going, no, I'm a Buc-ee's kind of guy, like, here we go. On the screen, here are some verses for you to do some follow-up with. I love when people go, I'm really interested. I wish I knew more. Here's how you know. Oh, I don't want to look it up. But, well, then I don't know how much you really want to jump into it. But if you do, here are some scriptures to write down. We're not going to read these, not going through these. But in Genesis chapter 10, you've got this mighty warrior named Nimrod, who you find a couple of times in the Old Testament, and his family, descendants, his clan, his tribe, they founded Babylon, and you've got a lot going on here, but you've got this phrase about the mighty warriors that connects to the same phrase when we talk about the Nephilim. Then you've got Numbers chapter 13, and some of you do know this because we've talked about this before, but Moses brought the people to the edge of the promised land, and he sent spies. He said, go see who's out there. Go see who's living there. How hard is this going to be for us to take our land? Two guys, Joshua and Caleb, came back and said, let's do this. God's got us. The rest of the crew said, no, man, there are some people out there, descendants of Anak, Nephilim, and they are huge. They make us feel like grasshoppers around there. They're monstrous. There is no way we can do this. And that fear and disobedience ultimately prevented them from experiencing a lot of what God had. In Joshua chapter 11, after Joshua has led the people and they've taken over the promised land, it says, all the descendants of Anak, the Nephilim, all the descendants of Anak were wiped out except for some Nephilim that are left in Gaza and Gath. And then you get to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and you get this little boy David that runs up with his slingshot. It says, where's that big dude from Gath? Show me where he is. He's taunting my God. I'm fighting back. So you see the thread running through here, and you say, well, we haven't dealt with giants. It is so weird. It is really weird. Just like stopping at Buc-ee's and taking pictures with that beaver is weird. So we're moving on. It says, while all of this mysterious stuff is interesting, there are some things that are easier to understand as to why God actually did what he did. So you can go back and run through that at another point, but let's continue on. In verse 5, it says, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. And if you write in your Bibles, or if you use your highlighter on your Bible on your app there, heart was deeply troubled. Mark that. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move on the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, while it is much cooler to think and talk about giants, this is actually what we need to grasp, because I think this, in many ways, is at the heart of why we often misunderstand this whole idea of Noah and a flood and an ark. Nowhere there did it say God was so angry and so mad and his blood was boiling to the point where he said, enough is enough, I'm going to destroy you. We don't find wrath or anger there. Instead, what we do find is this phrase, the Lord regretted he had made humans and his heart was deeply troubled. And that phrase, heart was deeply troubled, literally means there was pain in the heart of the Lord. When he looked at what he on his creation, when he saw that, it broke his heart. Now, I'm very careful when I'm reading through the Bible not to put human emotions on to God. Because just because I feel a certain way about something doesn't necessarily mean God feels the same way. I could say, well, that would make me mad. I don't know if it necessarily makes him mad. I don't want to put that on him. But we do have here that there was pain in his heart, and that is what moved him to do something about it. You had these spiritual beings that were creating offspring with humans. God said, that should not be. And then I've got my own humans that were killing each other, and they're destroying the ground. They're destroying creation. All of that broke his heart. And the response was what he ended up doing. So as we work through this, realizing the emotion in his heart was pain and not anger. There could have been anger there, but we don't have that there. That's just us speculating. Because of that, the question that I've been wrestling with throughout this part of God's story is, was the flood, Noah, ark, was that whole moment judgment or was that mercy? Because if I look at it as judgment, then I'm thinking there is anger, there is wrath, there is, I'm going to pay you back, you will not get away with this type thing. And it's true, God will not be mocked. We do reap what we sow. But here in this moment, is it judgment or is it God saying, you know what? You have chosen your path. And if this is what you want death, then I'll allow you to have that. But this guy has gotten my attention, and out of mercy, I'm not going to wipe everything out. Instead, I'm going to begin again. I'm going to start over, and I'm starting over with someone with faith like that guy. And it might seem very similar, but I think those are two different ways to look at what is happening here in this moment. Later on, a few thousand years later, there's a man named Paul who began to be a follower of Jesus after hating Jesus, and he followed Jesus. And then he got to a point where he was helping churches work through things and even starting churches. And in one of those letters, called the letter to the Romans, in chapter 1, he writes that since the beginning of creation, God's goodness, God's presence has been obvious to all. But creation turned its back and walked away. And then there's this weird phrase. Paul said, and God gave them over. Out of his wrath, God gave them over to their desires. And the more I've wrestled with that through the years, the more I realize that the greatest expression of God's wrath is not his heavy hand crushing me. It is his merciful hand just being removed, him saying, Chad, if that's what you want, okay, that's your choice, then you can stay on this road, this path you're on. You can continue on this cycle, and you will experience exactly what it is that you're choosing. Because you could go back to the beginning, and he looked at Adam and Eve, and he said, what have you done? But instead of striking them dead and beginning again with another couple, he covered them. He literally made a garment for them, and he covered them. Then Cain kills his brother, and he could have said, Cain, that's it. I'm going to crush you right here. I'm going to eliminate you. Instead, he said, Cain, get out. You're going to have to wander. You can't be. I'm not going to allow this in my house. And Cain said, well, I'm going to die, so I'm going to put a mark on you so no one can hurt you. But you can't be here. Your heart doesn't belong here. Mercy. So many times over the next 1,000 years, God could have stepped in and said, stop it. Just stop. I'm going to end it all. He gave them chance after chance, moment after moment. And finally, we've got this man named Noah, and God says, his faith has caught my attention. I'm going to wash this clean, and I'm going to allow creation to live. That's my mercy. I'm not going to wipe it all out. I'm going to wash it and allow it to grow again. And I'm going to start over. I'm going to start over with Noah, with his family. So is it judgment? Is it mercy? There's a lot there. It could turn into another Bucky's moment. So let's just kind of go on. But verse 12, it says, God saw how corrupt the earth had become and told Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. And to our knowledge, this is the first time that Noah heard God's voice. Now, there could have been other things that happened. We don't have all the details of Noah. We're introduced to him basically when he's, 420 years old or 480 years old. But we don't have any evidence of that. What we do have is God in this moment interrupting Noah and saying, I've seen you. All those times when you could have taken the same path, but on the same cycle everyone else was on, you chose to do differently. You chose to say, my daddy can live however he wants to live. I'm not going to live that way. My family will not be that way. Everybody else around can laugh. They can do whatever they want to do. They can think I've lost my mind, but I am going to stay close to the one I believe in. Say, well, I'm sure he was up every morning. He didn't have a Bible. There were no commandments. Moses hadn't lived. There was nothing other than stories of the faithfulness of God, and Noah looking at creation going, this cannot be an accident. There is someone out there, and I believe it's the one I've heard about, the Lord, who spoke to Adam, who was gracious, allowed Adam and Eve to even have another child after they lost Abel, that I believe and I trust him. And God looked at Noah and said, all those moments, I've watched every one of them. You thought you were the only one standing? No, you've been with me the whole time, and I've been with you the whole time. And I'm going to begin again. I'm going to start with you, so build a box. And we're going to build a box, and we're going to put you in a box, and we're going to ultimately find refuge and hope in this space. Then in verse 13, 120 years after that moment we read about a second ago, it says, on that very day, Noah, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. Often feels like God was shutting people out, but he was actually shutting Noah in and protecting him in this moment. And then we know that after the flood came, God allowed the waters to recede and ultimately gave Noah a promise he would never do it again with the rainbow, which is that reminder. But the irony of this whole deal is that even though Noah was going to be that first person to start again, to begin again, and God was going to recreate what he had done with Adam and Eve, Noah instead blew it. He got this moment, had this mercy, and he blew it. What do I mean? Well, when Noah got off the ark, and this was not a mistake necessarily, but he gets off the ark, he releases the animals. God says, I want you to rule the earth. I want you to be fruitful. I want you to multiply. Your people are going to govern this place. You're going to, all the same words we read in creation and last week. He told the same thing to Moses. It was pretty obvious. Moses, we're starting again. We're doing this. So Moses is thankful. He's going to have a worship moment. And it's kind of funny to me. I imagine being the animals. You finally get off like, whoa, we made it, or whatever animals say when they make it. And then Noah turned to like 4 or 5 of them and said, hey, come here. What? What's that behind your back? Oh, nothing. So he sacrifices these animals, and imagine making it off the ark after all of that. You and your animal wife, and then So he has the sacrifice. He lays them on the altar. He worships God, and God says, begin again. And Noah's like, well, I guess you do a garden. That's what happened before. So he plants a garden, and then his garden produces fruit. He makes wine. He drinks way too much of it. He gets drunk out of his mind. And in the next morning, we have this really strange scene in which he is naked in his tent. Something weird happened with his family that night. He is embarrassed and ashamed. He calls a curse down on his grandchild and says, you're out of here and you're going to experience this. Everything fell apart. It all started over. He got back on the cycle. The same one that he had said, I will never do that. I'm not doing that. And God watched him and God said, I will work through you. When he finally experienced God's mercy, he stepped right back on and began the cycle of violence, the cycle of destruction, and the cycle of death again. We're all at some point in our lives on a ride, and we're in a cycle, and we have to make the choice of whether just to continue what we're doing or to get off and say, enough is enough. I'm not comfortable with where that's going to lead. It reminds me of a time over 20 years ago. I was a college pastor, and I took a group of college students to Florida for a mission trip. And while we were there, part of the reward was, on one day, I surprised them with tickets to Universal Studios. And so we went to Universal Studios, an entire group of college students, 30 or 40 of us, and we're all there. And on one of the rides, it's a Spider-Man ride, and it's different now. I've been back once since then, but it was this ride that basically tells you the story of the movie. This was back when bad Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, but Spider-Man. So we're in the Spider-Man thing. We're going through that, and we're on one part of the ride, and we're all in these little carts, and I'm there with one other guy, and then we have two of our buddies behind us, and we're on this ride, and our ride breaks right there, like right in the middle of the ride, and we were actually up. I remember I was leaning to my left, I'm holding on to my right, and our little cart breaks down. The whole track is shut down. And we're broken, actually, under this one particular scene in which the Goblin, if you've never seen Spider-Man before, the Goblin's got his little hoverboard-looking thing, and he's right over you. And every 10 to 15 seconds, you get this hot air that the Goblin blows down on you. It just goes, and it's like right on you. Well, who gets stuck under me? Like, I'm right there. So for about 10 to 15 minutes, we're just stuck in the dark with all this loud stuff going on, loud music. And every 15 seconds, I'm getting breathed on by this fake goblin. And it was just a little unnerving and a little much. And we're hot, and I'm getting breathed on, and we're getting a little delirious. It's just a lot going on. Well, finally, they get the ride going. They pull us back around. And the operator came up and said, "We are so sorry. On behalf of Universal Studios, we want to let you know, like, you can ride it again." So I looked at my friend, and we kind of over our shoulder looked at the guys behind, and none of us wanted to admit, like, we need to get off this ride. Like, we need to get off here. We're going to ruin the entire day. Like, none of us were feeling a certain way, but none of us knew it until afterwards. And so we all looked and like, okay, we just stayed on, and so we rode it again. Needless to say, nausea, it was just a bad day. Lots of garbage cans, lots of pausing along the way. It was a tough day, but we had our chance. The operator stepped up and said, "Do you want to get off?" We had our moment. And throughout history, there are times in each life in which the operator steps forward and says, "Do you want to get off? Are you ready to get off this ride?" And in that moment, we all have to make those decisions. Noah made the decision. It saved his life. It saved his family's life. They chose not to be a part of that. So the question I want to ask all of us today is, first, where is our story headed? Because our track is leading somewhere. That cycle, you've seen it before in the generation before you. You watched it with your mom or your dad or your sister or brother. You've seen it around you. Right now, if you continue on the path you're on, where is that headed? 2, when was the last time you had a chance to get off? Because all of us have those moments. It's that moment where you got caught, and then they said, "I tell you what, we'll just don't do it again." And you're like, "Oh, I'll never do this again." Or you thought they were coming for you, and they walked past you and went somewhere else. It happens on the interstate all the time. The cops are going, I'm like, "Oh my goodness." I'm pulling over, and they keep going. I'm like, "Yeah, let's go." So I have an option then. Do I go 69 or 70 miles an hour, or do I go, "Yeah, I made it, 79 again"? Like, I have a choice to make there. And we all have those moments. Hard conversations. "Hey, did you do that?" "Yeah, I'm sorry." "That's okay, let's move on." Okay, how do I handle that mercy? When was the last time you had one of those moments where you knew it was God going, "This is your chance. You want to get off this ride? Like, there's mercy here." And then along with that, the last question. If that was your last opportunity to get off, are you okay knowing where this is headed? If that was your last moment, if God never interrupts you again, are you okay knowing that your life, your story, is going to be about anxiety, about secrets, about embarrassment, about depression, addiction, whatever that may be, however that may look in your life? And most of us would say, absolutely not. I'm not planning on this being the end. I mean, I've got a lot of growing. Well, today may be one of those days, and it might be one of the last days where God interrupts you and stops you where you are and says, "Okay, do you want to get off this ride? Are you ready now? Just to step out. Because right now, I'm ready to cover you with mercy and let you begin again. But if you continue on, I think we all know where this is headed. And when I look at the story of Noah, although he ended up blowing it in the end, just like most of us end up doing, and we abuse mercy, we mock God's mercy, there were moments along the way where he chose to step off and say no. And in the end, it saved him from something he didn't even know was coming. And none of us knows what is going to happen around the corner for us individually, for our families, in our jobs, school, whatever, our health. But today may be the day that God invites you to step off and say, enough is enough. That has been where I'm going, but that's not where I'm headed now. I am stepping off of this and I'm going to allow God to do what only he can do, and that is to start something new and begin a new work in my life. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. And this may be the moment you step out into the new creation that God has for you. Let's pray.